Things had turned bad. I hadn't saved anyone in months. I just needed a few slow nights, followed by a couple of days off.
Frank is a paramedic haunted by those he could not save and driven to the brink by the fact that he has not been able to save anyone lately. He brings in an old man who had a heart attack. The old man lives, but he will never be the same and probably will never wake up. The old man suffers, and Frank absorbs his suffering. The old man's daughter, Mary, relapses into her drug addiction due to not knowing what will happen to her father. After a few nights of disaster, Frank desperately wants to quit his job, but his boss will not fire him, and Frank will not leave his job on his own accord. The streets begin to drive him mad. Eventually, Frank, seeing the old man suffer for days and with the family unwilling to let him go, decides to unplug him from the machine and allows him to pass. Frank's conflict in the film, his desire to save people and his recent inability to do so, is tangled up in something that 20th century existentialist philosophers Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre called mauvaise foi, bad faith. It is a phenomenon in which human beings, under considerable pressure from societal forces, take on false values, disown their own responsibility, and therefore freedom, and begin to act inauthentically. In Sartre's famous work, Being and Nothingness, he wrote that human beings have a dual nature that exists as both subject and object. He called them pour soi, meaning for itself, and en soi, meaning in itself. Pour soi, he wrote, is that which is what it is not, and which is not what it is. The pour soi is the transcendent aspect of humanity, meaning the aspect that represents a human being's potential to transcend who they currently are to become something else in the future. A human being is always more than what they are because they have the freedom to make decisions and change aspects of their life. When Frank makes decisions to further or change his life, we are seeing that aspect of himself. When he remarks that he remains the same and that he cannot change himself, we are seeing the en soi. The en soi, the in itself, is that which is what it is, according to Sartre. Frank is a paramedic who cannot save anyone. What Frank wants to become is a paramedic who can save someone, or not a paramedic anymore at all. That is what Sartre meant when he said that we are two people. But when Frank becomes a paramedic who can save someone, that does not mean he has somehow achieved pour soi, like achieving nirvana or something, because we are never a finished product as long as we live. The two aspects of ourselves simply exist at the same time. That is what is meant by human consciousness being transcendent. Frank's consciousness transcends what it is at every moment and moves towards becoming what it will be as a result of future choices. Tom, one of Frank's paramedic partners, treats the ambulance as if it were a person. Tom refers to the ambulance as she and speaks of her in those terms. Tom becomes violent with those who he believes do not have worth, and in the end of the film he becomes violent towards the ambulance as a result of his bad night. Tom might do well to read some Sartre because objects like this ambulance, indeed all objects, are not capable of transcendence. Objects are what they are. En soi. They can change in the sense that Tom can break it, sure, but they cannot decide to change. They are immanents. They have no interior potentiality the way Frank and other human beings have interior potentiality. In contrast, human consciousness always transcends itself. As subjects, people cannot be reduced to the status of objects, and objects cannot be elevated to the status of subjects. But here's the thing, and here's how this relates more closely to bringing out the dead. Pure immanence, meaning being an object incapable of transcendence, is not possible for living humans. But despite this, people try to do this anyway. Human beings both celebrate and fear the freedom of choice because it ties us down to having responsibility for our lives, our happiness, and our moral decisions. Søren Kierkegaard, an earlier existentialist philosopher, said that the infinite possibilities of free will create impossible to predict scenarios. Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom.
Frank, take it easy. What happened?
He flipped out!
His example was a man standing on the edge of a precipice. The man fears falling, and the man feels an impulse to fling himself over the edge. We see this in the film as Frank attempts to save a drug dealer who is trapped on a ledge. While on the ledge, the drug dealer contemplates his choices in his life. See, the burden of acknowledging personal responsibility for his choices and accepting moral liability for his choices probably tempted him to disavow his freedom and to deny his transcendence. Sartre called this something else: negative ecstasy. Scary moments late at night when one is alone with their thoughts and realizes how much freedom they have. It's too much, and some of the options are terrifying, but we are far more free than we say aloud. Frank believes his job as a paramedic is destroying himself, but he does not quit. He insists that his boss fire him instead. The boss will not fire Frank because he has so few paramedics. Although there are some financial consequences to doing this, Frank definitely has the freedom to quit. He chooses not to because he is living, as Sartre put it, inauthentically. He would prefer to think he does not have this freedom than to exercise it and potentially better his life. If he quits, then he would have to accept that it was his choice all along, and that anyone who dies as a result of his changing careers would at least be in part because of himself. If he is fired, he can lie to himself and say it wasn't his fault, even though Frank clearly wants to leave his job and tells his boss to fire him every day. But Sartre did not think of being authentic as a goal in and of itself. Far from it. Dismissing bad faith and living authentically is meant to allow yourself to achieve things, to prosper, to help others, or anything worthwhile. He said, "If you seek authenticity for authenticity's sake, you are no longer authentic." Abandoning bad faith is only the first step in having a worthwhile life. Bad faith is a common, unconscious attitude that people adopt, according to Sartre. In short, bad faith is when we lie to ourselves to convince ourselves of something that is easier to accept than the authentic truth. Sartre believed that what we constantly lie to ourselves about is that we have no options. We do, but we find it more reassuring to say that we don't. This lets us off the hook for our actions. Frank muses about this in the film. In his narration, he states that when he saves a life, he always takes responsibility for it. That was all him, all his doing. However, when he loses a life, that is the fault of others or other inanimate objects. He gives examples. The tube didn't go in. I got there as fast as I could, etc. When Frank does good, it is because of his choices and his abilities. When he does not, the blame must be placed somewhere else for his own psychological well-being. This is a perfect example of Sartre's version of bad faith. Frank does not live authentically because he lies to himself about his choices, his transcendence of consciousness. At the end of the film, Frank finally takes responsibility for his life. He brought in a man who was dying, and now, convinced that that man wants to die, allows him to do so. Whether or not this was the right thing to do is a topic all on its own, but the point is that the film is showing us Frank finally accepting that he is not a passenger in his own life. He rejects his bad faith and takes responsibility for his life and those around him. Simone de Beauvoir expounded on this. De Beauvoir would call Frank a serious man, someone who subordinated himself to some outside cause, in this case being a paramedic and subordinate to a boss's choices about Frank's life. To Simone de Beauvoir, Frank is in bad faith because he denies his own freedom. Bad faith causes Frank and his boss to blame each other for indecisiveness about Frank's career. Existentialist thought can upset people and make them miserable if they see it from a certain perspective, but existentialists like Simone de Beauvoir had a different outlook. Again, living authentically is not an end goal. People who walk around being jerks to others under the guise of being honest are not living authentically. They are lying about their motivations for treating others poorly, that motivation being their own internal cruelty. Instead, de Beauvoir once said, "One's life has value so long as one attributes value to the life of others, by means of love, friendship, indignation, and compassion." Our freedom can be terrifying, but it also gives us the option to be our best selves. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.